7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
Portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls are here at DC's Museum of the Bible, removing all obscurity and open for all to see.
In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy threw a rock into a cave near the Dead Sea, heard something crack inside, and climbed inside to find ancient clay jars holding leather scrolls wrapped in linen. Those scrolls turned out to be the oldest known biblical manuscripts dating back over 2,000 years. They would become the most fought-over religious discovery in human history.
The most important discovery in biblical archaeology that has happened and probably will happen for the foreseeable future.
For 70 years, the greatest scholarly minds on Earth studied them and still could not answer the most disturbing questions hiding inside them. Why did the same cave hold multiple completely different versions of the same sacred book? Then, in 2020, scientists sequenced ancient DNA extracted directly from the animal skins the scrolls were written on. What they found did not just surprise the academic world. It tore apart everything scholars thought they knew about the Bible, where it actually came from, and how it became what it is today. The puzzle nobody could solve. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy threw a rock into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard something break. When he climbed inside, he found clay jars. Inside those jars were scrolls, writings on animal skin, wrapped in linen, hidden in the dark for nearly 2,000 years. The world called it the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. But what came next was not triumph. It was chaos. The scrolls had not survived intact. They had shattered into roughly 25,000 tiny fragments. No titles, no page numbers, no way to know which piece belonged to which manuscript. Some fragments were smaller than a postage stamp, carrying only a single letter. Most of the original material was gone forever, turned to dust in the caves long before anyone found it. Scholars had only 3 tools available: handwriting analysis, visual inspection of the parchment, and educated guesswork. That was the foundation of 70 years of scholarship on the most important religious texts ever discovered. And here is where it gets dark. When scholars joined 2 fragments that did not belong together, they created a false text. They made an ancient prophet say something he never said. Entire theological arguments were built on documents that never existed. Scholars knew this risk. They pressed on anyway because they had no other method. For 4 decades, access to these fragments was controlled by a tiny group of scholars, not an open international team, a small inner circle who decided who could see the scrolls, who could publish findings, and what conclusions the world was allowed to reach. Every other scholar on Earth was locked out. Oxford professor Geza Vermes, one of the most respected scroll scholars alive, was denied access. He said publicly that nobody outside the circle even knew what documents existed. His words were direct. Nobody knows what is there. Such a scandal is difficult to quantify. The man running that inner circle was John Strugnell of Harvard University. He spent virtually his entire working life controlling access to the most important Jewish religious texts ever discovered. He was eventually fired. Not for the secrecy. He was fired after he gave an interview calling Judaism a horrible religion. That man was the gatekeeper of these texts for decades. And it gets worse. While legitimate scholars were being locked out, forgers were flooding the market. After 2002, at least 70 fake Dead Sea Scroll fragments appeared for sale. In 2020, all 16 fragments at the Museum of the Bible in Washington were confirmed as modern forgeries, made from old leather with modern ink, deliberately aged to look ancient. Scholars were fooled. Institutions paid millions. This was the world the DNA scientists were walking into. But before science could fix anything, it had to face the theory that had been built inside this broken system. A theory that had ruled the entire field for 70 years, and it had a problem nobody wanted to talk about. The theory that ruled the world. For 70 years, the answer seemed clear. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written by a group called the Essenes. The Essenes were described as a strict Jewish community that turned their backs on mainstream society and retreated to the desert. They lived at a settlement called Qumran, right near where the scrolls were found. According to ancient accounts, they followed extreme religious laws, owned nothing individually, and spent their lives copying sacred texts. When the Roman army marched toward Jerusalem in 68 CE, the story goes, the Essenes hid their entire library in the nearby caves to protect it. Then Rome came, the Essenes were destroyed, and the scrolls stayed hidden for nearly 2,000 years. It was a clean story. Universities taught it, documentaries repeated it, and museums displayed it as settled fact for decades. There was just one problem. The word Essenes does not appear once in the Dead Sea Scrolls, not a single time. Across 25,000 fragments and hundreds of manuscripts, the group that supposedly wrote all of it never once used that name to describe themselves. 70 years of scholarship, built around a name that the supposed authors never used. So where did that name come from? Two ancient writers, one named Josephus and one named Pliny the Elder. Both lived during the Roman era roughly 2,000 years ago, and both wrote about a Jewish group they called the Essenes. But neither of them ever lived with this group. Neither explained exactly where their information came from. Some historians believe they were simply borrowing from each other, passing the same unverified description back and forth. Others believe the accounts were built on rumor. The entire Essene theory, the one that dominated global scholarship for 70 years, rested on two writers whose claims about this group could not be confirmed. Then a scholar named Rachel Elior said what many had quietly feared, but never dared to say out loud. Elior was a professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and her conclusion was this: the Essenes never existed, not as a real distinct group. She argued that Josephus had either invented them entirely or so badly misrepresented whatever he heard that the name was worthless as historical evidence. If she was even partially right, the framework that governed Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship for 70 years was built on a group that never existed. 70 years. Gone. Other scholars fought back hard, but they could not answer the central problem she raised. The name was not in the texts. It had never been there. While that fight was still raging, a separate theory began gaining ground. What if the scrolls had nothing to do with desert outcasts? What if they were written by priests from Jerusalem itself, men who had been driven out of power? Here is what happened. Jerusalem had a high priest, a position considered sacred and reserved for one specific family line chosen by God. But a ruling dynasty called the Hasmoneans forcibly seized that position for themselves. They were not from the right family. To the priests who had held that role, this was not a political dispute. It was a religious crime. Some of those displaced priests may have walked away from Jerusalem in fury, taking their sacred texts with them to Qumran. Not outcasts, not mystics, insiders. Men who had stood at the center of Jewish religious life, now exiled, preserving what they believed a corrupt ruling class was destroying. And then there is a detail that the Essene theory never had a good answer for. Some of the scrolls found in the caves are older than the Qumran settlement itself. Texts were being placed in those caves before the supposed Essene community even existed there. Someone else was using those caves first. Nobody knows who they were. The theory survived not because the evidence was solid. It survived because too many careers and reputations depended on it being true. Then two people met on a bus, and everything began to fall apart. The conversation that changed everything. In 2012, two professors at Tel Aviv University sat next to each other on a bus during a faculty orientation. One was Oded Rechavi, a molecular biologist whose work was entirely focused on DNA, the unique genetic code that exists inside every living creature. The other was Noam Mizrahi, a biblical scholar who had spent years working on the ancient texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Mizrahi started describing the problem that had defeated every scholar before him. 25,000 fragments. no reliable way to match them. Pieces were being incorrectly joined together, creating false texts that were then published and studied as genuine ancient documents. The field had been fighting this problem for 70 years and had made almost no real progress. Richavi asked one question: "What are the scrolls made of?" "Parchment," said Mizrahi. "Animal skin." Richavi stopped. He thought for a moment. Then he said something that would change everything. "Then the parchment has DNA. Every animal that ever lived has a unique genetic fingerprint locked inside its skin. That fingerprint does not vanish just because the animal died and its hide was made into parchment. If two fragments came from the same animal, their DNA would match. If they came from different animals, it would not. No opinions, no guesswork, no handwriting comparisons open to interpretation. The genetics would give a clear, definite answer, one that no traditional method ever could." It was the most important idea in Dead Sea Scrolls research in 70 years, and it came from a biologist on a bus who had never studied ancient texts in his life. But the excitement did not last long. The scrolls were considered sacred by multiple religious communities across the world. No one was permitted to cut them, scratch them, or remove any material from any surface that carried writing. Every DNA extraction method scientists had developed over decades required taking a physical sample from the object being tested. Every single one of those methods was completely off the table. There seemed to be no way through. Then they found the dust. Over decades of being handled and stored, tiny particles of parchment had naturally broken off the scroll fragments and gathered at the bottom of their storage containers. That dust was invisible to the naked eye, but it still carried ancient biological material from the animal skin it had come from. Scientists carefully collected that dust only from blank edges and damaged areas where no writing existed, and carried it to some of the most controlled laboratory environments on Earth. Full protective suits, sealed rooms where air pressure was kept higher inside than outside, so that nothing from the surrounding environment could flow in and contaminate the samples. Every tool and surface sterilized with ultraviolet light between each use. The same level of control used for the most sensitive and irreplaceable biological material in the world, now applied to fragments of ancient scripture. But even that dust was not clean. Everyone who had ever touched those scrolls over the past 70 years had left their own DNA behind. Scholars, conservators, the forgers, the black market dealers, the inner circle that controlled access for 4 decades. All of their genetic material was sitting in the same dust as the ancient animal DNA. The scientists had to computationally identify and strip away all of that modern contamination just to find the ancient signal underneath. And the ancient DNA had been under assault for 2,000 years. The parchment-making process had already torn most of it apart at a molecular level. Then iron-based ink was applied directly on top, and iron corrodes DNA on contact. Then 2,000 years in a desert cave with shifting heat, cold, moisture, and minerals eating through whatever remained. By the time scientists reached for that genetic code, almost everything had been destroyed. It took 7 years, hundreds of samples, thousands of hours of laboratory work, and then the results came back. The first finding looked almost too simple to matter, but it demolished something the entire field had accepted without question for 70 years. The DNA said it was wrong. Almost every fragment tested was sheep, not goat. Every match ever made based on how the parchment looked or felt had been made using the wrong animal as the reference point. Years of careful work built on a mistake nobody caught because nobody checked. But that was not the finding that broke everything. 2 fragments came back as cowhide. Cows cannot live in the Judean desert. A cow needs dozens of gallons of fresh water every single day. It needs open land with grass and pasture. The desert near the Dead Sea has rock, sand, and almost no water. It is one of the harshest environments in the entire region. A community living at Qumran could not have kept cattle. The land could not support them, which meant those 2 fragments were not made at Qumran. They came from somewhere else, somewhere with water, somewhere with grazing land, somewhere completely unlike the Judean desert, almost certainly somewhere near Jerusalem, roughly 20 miles away. That single result broke the Essene theory completely, not damaged it, broke it. The genetic evidence proved beyond any scientific doubt that the Dead Sea Scrolls did not all come from one place. Some of them were written somewhere else entirely and carried into that desert by someone. Now think about who carried them. And when? Rome laid siege to Jerusalem in 68 CE. The city fell and burned in 70 CE. People fled with whatever they could carry. Some of them carried their most sacred texts across 20 miles of open desert to reach those caves. The DNA tells us those people existed. It tells us their animals grazed in fertile land near a city. It cannot tell us their names. It cannot tell us if they made it out alive. The scrolls reached the caves. The people who carried them, running from a burning city with soldiers behind them, almost certainly did not. And then there was one more thing the DNA exposed. One of those cow parchment fragments had already been matched by scholars to a sheep parchment fragment and placed in the same scroll. The match had been published, accepted, studied for years as a single unified ancient document. The DNA proved it was completely wrong. Two fragments from two different animals, from two different regions, had been fused together and handed to the world as one text. Scholars had been reading and interpreting a document that never existed. Both of those cow parchment fragments came from the same book of the Bible. And what the DNA revealed about that book was the most disturbing finding of all. The two Jeremiahs and the Bible that was not finished. Both cow parchment fragments were from the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is one of the most important books in the Bible. It is the story of a prophet who stood in Jerusalem and warned the people that destruction was coming. He told them what would happen if they did not change course. They did not listen, and the destruction came exactly as he said it would. It is a book about warning, about refusal, and about consequences. But when the scientists looked at those two fragments, they found something that had nothing to do with where the parchment came from. The two fragments were not two copies of the same book. They were two completely different versions of the book of Jeremiah. One version was longer. It matched the Hebrew Bible that exists today. The other was significantly shorter. Entire sections were missing. The chapters were arranged in a completely different order. These were not small differences or copying mistakes. These were two separate books, carrying the same prophet's name, saying different things. Scholars had known for years that two versions existed. They had debated endlessly about what it meant. Some said scribes made errors. Some said one version was edited down from the other. Some said they came from different time periods. Nobody could prove anything either way. The DNA settled it. Different animals, different genetic profiles, almost certainly different regions. These two versions of Jeremiah were not variations of the same tradition. They were two completely independent traditions, being written, copied, and preserved by two separate communities living in different parts of ancient Judea, at the same time with no apparent awareness that the other version existed. And both communities believed their version was the true and sacred Word of God. This is what that means. At the time these scrolls were being written, the Bible was not a finished book. It was still being decided. Different communities held different versions of the same scripture and treated them as equally holy. Nobody had yet determined which words were correct and which were not. That determination came later. At some point, a group of people looked at both versions of Jeremiah and chose one. The longer version entered the Hebrew Bible. The shorter version ended up broken in fragments at the bottom of a desert cave. Whatever was in those missing sections is gone. Whatever the shorter version said that the longer one did not, whatever chapters were reordered, whatever words were removed when someone decided which version would survive, most of it cannot be fully recovered. And then it goes even further. The shorter version of Jeremiah found in the scrolls closely matches the version of the Old Testament that early Christians used, a Greek translation called the Septuagint. The longer version matches the Hebrew Bible used by Jewish communities. Whatever was in those missing sections is gone. Whatever the shorter version said that the longer one did not, whatever chapters were reordered, whatever words were removed when someone decided which version would survive, most of it cannot be fully recovered. And then it goes even further. The shorter version of Jeremiah found in the scrolls closely matches the version of the Old Testament that early Christians used, a Greek translation called the Septuagint. The longer version matches the Hebrew Bible used by Jewish communities. This means the difference between the Jewish Bible and the Christian Old Testament in the book of Jeremiah may not be a translation issue at all. It may mean both traditions have been reading from two genuinely different ancient source texts for 2,000 years without fully knowing it. Professor Mizrahi put it plainly. A Torah scroll in a synagogue in Kiev today is virtually identical to one in Sydney down to the letter. That level of consistency feels ancient. It feels like it was always that way. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove it was not. That consistency was the result of human decisions. Decisions that removed entire traditions from the record. Traditions that real communities had lived by, prayed over, and died for. The caves held the last evidence of what those decisions erased. But what the DNA revealed about the caves themselves was darker than anyone expected. The caves were not a library. They were a tomb. When the full DNA results were laid out and analyzed together, a picture emerged that nobody had clearly seen before. Some of the parchments were made from closely related animals, siblings, parents, and offspring. Animals raised together in the same herd, in the same location, at roughly the same time. Those genetic clusters pointed to specific places where groups of scrolls had been produced together, local communities making their own texts from their own animals. But those clusters were mixed together with parchments that had no genetic connection to anything else in the collection. Completely different animals, different herds, different regions. The scrolls did not come from one production center. They came from many, from communities spread across ancient Judea, each producing their own texts, each depositing them in the same caves. This gave real weight to a theory that had been proposed but never proven. The caves near Qumran were not one group's private hiding place. They were a geniza. A geniza is a specific concept in Jewish tradition. When a religious text contains the name of God, Jewish law forbids destroying it. It cannot be burned, it cannot be discarded. It must be stored in a designated sacred place until it can be given a proper burial. Communities across ancient Judea had likely been bringing their worn-out and damaged texts to these caves for decades, possibly for centuries, long before Rome ever became a threat. The caves were already full when the crisis arrived. In 68 CE, Rome began its siege of Jerusalem. In 70 CE, the city fell. The temple, the most sacred site in Jewish religious life, was burned to the ground. The destruction was total. Communities that had existed for generations were wiped out in months. People ran. They carried their most precious possessions. And some of them carried their scrolls, texts written on cow parchment near Jerusalem, into the desert and into those caves, adding them to everything already stored there. Then they were gone. Oded Rechavi framed it in a way that is impossible to forget. He asked people to picture this. Israel is destroyed completely. Every community gone, every building burned, and the only thing that survives is the library of one isolated extremist group. What would the world conclude about Jewish life from that single library? Almost nothing accurate, almost nothing complete. That is exactly what scholars had been doing for 70 years. The DNA now shows the caves were not one group's library. They were the collected religious writings of an entire civilization, gathered from communities across the region, left in the desert by people who never came back to retrieve them. And the texts those communities left behind were not all peaceful prayers and scripture. One of the scrolls found in those caves is called the War Scroll. It is not a religious meditation. It is a military manual. It describes in precise detail how to organize troops for battle, what weapons to carry, what signals to use on the battlefield, and how to completely destroy the enemy. The enemy is referred to as the sons of darkness, That category included Rome, but it also included other Jewish communities that the writers disagreed with. The scroll was a plan for holy war against their own neighbors. Multiple communities were reading this text. Multiple communities were copying it. The DNA proves that. These were not scholars quietly preserving ancient wisdom. They were people who believed a final catastrophic war was coming and had written a manual for how to fight it. They prepared for that war. They never got to fight it. Rome arrived first. The DNA showed us what those people left behind. But what it cannot show us is what was truly lost when they were gone, what the DNA cannot tell us. The DNA study analyzed 26 fragments out of 25,000. That is roughly 0.1% of the total material. And from that fraction, that almost invisible sliver, scientists demolished a theory that had controlled the entire field for 7 decades. Everything this video has described, every shattered assumption, every dark revelation, came from testing less than 1% of what exists in those collections, which means one question sits over all of it. What is in the other 99.9%? Nobody knows, and some of it will never be known. Fragments that crumbled to dust inside the caves before anyone ever found them. Communities whose only surviving trace was a scroll that did not make it. Traditions whose texts were too damaged to read and too fragile to preserve, already gone before science had any chance to reach them. Then there is the suppression that made everything worse. A full quarter of the Dead Sea Scrolls material remained unpublished more than 30 years after the initial discovery. Not because the texts were too difficult to work with, because the inner circle that controlled access deliberately moved slowly, protected their territory, and decided what the outside world was allowed to see and when. Entire texts sat locked in drawers in Jerusalem while scholars around the world debated a consensus built on partial evidence. What those hidden texts contained, and whether they would have changed the story far earlier, is a question that cannot be fully answered now. Some scrolls were written in deliberately coded scripts that took decades to crack. One system, called Cryptic B, was only fully deciphered in 2025. Scholars still argue over why those codes were used. Some believe the scribes were hiding their content from rival communities or enemies within their own world. The DNA can tell us what animal the parchment came from. It cannot tell us what the scribe writing on that parchment was afraid of. It cannot tell us who they were hiding from, or what they wrote that felt dangerous enough to encrypt. And the DNA cannot give back the people. It cannot tell us the name of the person who carried a version of Jeremiah out of Jerusalem while the city was burning. It cannot tell us whether they were alone or part of a group. It cannot tell us if they stopped and looked back at the smoke. It cannot tell us if they believed, when they placed those scrolls in that cave, that they would one day come back to retrieve them. They never came back. The scrolls stayed in the dark for 2,000 years. When that shepherd boy threw a rock into a cave in 1947 and heard something break, he had no idea what he had found. He had found the last surviving voices of communities that Rome erased. Communities with their own scriptures, their own versions of the Bible, their own understanding of God. All of it sealed in clay jars in the desert, waiting for someone to listen. Scientists finally listened. And what the DNA of animals dead for 2,000 years told us was this: what was lost is greater than what was saved, and most of it is gone forever.